Last week, my close personal acquaintance and ideological frenemy Kip Winder wrote a piece for Fortune and Freedom answering a question I've posed many times before. What happens if we don't manage to decarbonize sufficiently to reach net zero by 2050? He argues carbon capture and sequestration, or CCS, will be the answer that fills in the gaps. Kit, before we dig into CCS, how are we going on the journey to net zero in more general terms?
Mixed, I would say. I think the thing I always say is that climate change is far worse than most people realise. The amount of natural disasters going on in the world that we don't hear about is extraordinary and rising. Insurance firms are on the front line and they are saying it's beyond belief. There's so many things we can't insure. So climate change is far worse than people realise. But there are so many more people working on brilliant solutions that are advancing much more quickly than people realise too. So yeah, it's going worse than expected and better than expected, depending on how you want to look at it.
One of the points you make in your article for Fortune and Freedom is that we have the technology to decarbonize about 80% of what we need to for our 2030 targets. At this point, it's more a question of whether we can actually roll them out, whether we can succeed in terms of building them and connecting them and so on and so forth. How's that side of things going? Because it seems to me in the last few weeks, actually, there's been this realization that actually we need an electricity grid to connect all these things, which seems to be a bit of an oversight, if you ask me. But there seems to be some gaps and holes in this more generally. So given how long it takes to try and fix these sorts of issues, are you optimistic about even decarbonizing the electricity system?
Yeah, there's definitely a big question around expectations here. So, what you're looking for me to say there is we're not going nearly fast enough. And that is absolutely true. Relative to 2030 targets, 2050 targets, we're not deploying at a quick enough rate across any of the three pillars that we spoke about, which is electrification, building out renewable capacity, and energy efficiency as well. And the sort of rise in global geopolitics is making it harder to, I guess, bring all 196 nations together to achieve those sort of global milestones. But at the same time, the pace of growth is still so much quicker than anyone could have imagined 10 years ago, because the falling costs of solar, wind, and electric vehicles and batteries, they've come down 90% in the last 10 or 15 years. And that means that they are just exploding onto the scene, driven mainly by China, which is just this sort of behemoth of climate investment, breaking efficiency records and capacity records every single year. So things are going incredibly quickly and far quicker than many of us could really have hoped for, but it's still not fast enough. And that's the key, I think.
Even under the more optimistic scenario, there's still going to be some things left that will not be decarbonized even by 2050, depending on how technology rolls out, of course. But the key point, which is the key to your article here, is that the question becomes, how do we address those parts of the economy that fail to decarbonize, regardless of how big a share of our economy that might be? So the solution to those, you argue, is carbon capture and sequestration, CCS. Take us through what CCS is in its simplest form, so that we can then discuss how that rollout's going.
Yeah, so as you say, cars currently run on petrol, can be electrified. That's a perfect like-for-like replacement, but that's not going to work for everything. And so probably we're going to need some sort of technology or solution to remove carbon from the atmosphere that we've already emitted. And that's even more important because carbon actually has a sort of 10 to 30 year duration in the atmosphere. So the warming effect is gradual and growing. So we're only dealing with the emissions now from maybe the 2000s or the 2010s. So imagine how much worse we'll be in 20 years. So there is this need to suck carbon back out of the air, or even stop it being emitted in the first place by attaching a sort of carbon filtration system to the top of a factory chimney or whatever. And there's a few ways to do this. The first one is trees, which we call nature's carbon capture. The formation of the universe created a vehicle for absorbing carbon and releasing oxygen. And trees can do this incredibly cheaply. It's obviously something we're very familiar with. The cost of carbon removal is around $15 to $30 per ton. So it's this amazing solution when technological carbon capture is currently costing maybe a few $100s per ton to maybe almost $1,000 per ton. So that technology is not yet ready, and trees are. But they have this problem of maybe scalability and land availability. Can they reach the scale we need? And I think it's the scalability of technological carbon capture that people are so excited about. The problem right now is cost and technology, and it's really those cost curves around solar, wind, renewables, electric vehicles, and storage that give people hope that maybe if we grow capacity like we have done for those other technologies, the costs can fall in a similar fashion, and the sort of learning rate can apply there too. But for now, direct air capture or carbon capture is where, using some sort of membrane or filtration system, you can suck out just the carbon molecules from the air or from the waste stream. And currently, it's only really viable when it's attached to a waste stream, because the concentration of CO2 is so much higher when it's a waste gas coming out of an industrial system. In the air, the concentration is so low that the membranes just are not ready really to take out a significant amount of carbon dioxide from the air. So currently, it's only attached to industrial processes, but hopefully with enough scale and cost reductions, we can get to a point when the scale is there to remove carbon from the atmosphere.
There's a deep irony in the idea that CCS only works when you're emitting a lot of carbon, but let's not go there. You summarize in your article how things have been going for CCS so far, because it's not a new idea. Lots of money's been invested in it. You point out that things haven't been going so well despite the huge amounts of money invested in it. Take us through whether things are improving, whether there's hope, how things have gone so far.
Okay, for once, you're actually not being negative enough about a climate technology, Nick, and I'm going to be even more critical. The performance so far has been terrible, and also the political associations of CCS are very strongly geared towards big oil trying to reclaim the narrative and trying to give themselves a future that isn't actually that clean. So there are hundreds of millions of dollars being invested, billions of dollars being invested, and the amount of useful carbon removal that has occurred is completely minimal. And wherever you look, there are stats that just boggle the mind, really, because if we'd spent all those billions of dollars planting trees, we could have been removing a lot of carbon by now, and they would keep doing it for the duration of the tree. So there's a big issue around the fact that big oil really want to push this technology, and they're putting loads of money into it, but so far they haven't really been able to achieve the efficiency or the scale that's needed to remove carbon from the atmosphere at a meaningful level. So far, it's both politically and economically been a big, big challenge for the industry.
Yeah, you accuse me of being too optimistic for a good reason here. And this is what I really want to get into with you. And it's something I've tried to discuss before, but I haven't found a way to explain it to people properly yet. So there's going to be a bit of a long explanation here, but this is the angle that's interesting, both for investors and for people thinking about how this is going to matter to them personally in their personal life. So if we assume that there's a number of things that we can't decarbonize in our day-to-day life, say flying, say shipping things internationally, whatever it might be, we don't know what those things are yet. But those things must then include the cost of sequestering the carbon that is emitted in that process. So if you want to fly to another country, you've got to pay for the cost of emitting the carbon that's emitted in the flight. If you want to buy olive oil from Spain or whatever it is, you've got to pay for the cost of sequestering the carbon that was emitted in the production of that olive oil. If the cost of carbon capture and sequestration is very low, it means we can go on living our life as we currently are, and the whole net zero transition will be relatively painless. If the cost is quite high, then a lot of the things we do each day, not necessarily each day, but each year as part of our life, might no longer become economical. We might no longer be able to afford doing them. So it seems to me that whatever the marginal cost of carbon capture and sequestration is, sucking carbon out of the air effectively, is going to define our standard of living, which is a pretty terrifying idea given what you've just said about how bad the performance of CCS has been so far. So give me some hope here that those however many tens of billions it was that you mentioned have been invested in ideas that might yet work, that might yet give us a cheap enough way to sequester carbon just out of the air, because we're not always able to install CCS installations and all of our emitting activities. Give me some hope that that money was invested in a way that is going to come up with a plausible solution so that our standard of living is not completely destroyed by this net zero goal.
Yes, I mean, the pricing of externalities is something that is on our horizon, and you could argue that if that had happened sooner, we would have electrified a lot more things a lot sooner. Has the money been invested well? I mean, there is a life cycle to investment in new technologies. At the beginning, a huge amount of capital is quote unquote wasted, but actually those are the failures you need to figure out what the right solutions are. You have to have a very broad shotgun, trying many different approaches, and that's why the sort of capital waste has been so high at this stage. But improvements have been made, and they're starting to narrow down into the technologies they think will work, whether it's biological or through fermentation, or actually the biological side I don't understand so well, but there's really interesting things happening there. But definitely the technology is improving, the scale is coming, the costs are coming down. Is it happening fast enough? When will it be able to reduce carbon from the atmosphere? It's still sort of anyone's guess, but we are making progress. So Nick, your Kobe beef over in Japan won't be costing 1,000, I suppose 100,000 yen per kilogram quite yet.
Yeah, it feels like a long way to go, and yet we've committed to this without any sort of way out of it, which is a terrifying combination, if you ask me. So whoever does come up with a cheap and effective way of carbon capture and sequestration, as far as I can tell, it'll be the biggest investment story in history.
Well, there is that element, whether it's going to be the provider of the cheapest technology that will be the big winner, or whether you can just look at an industry level. Let's say you are a copper smelting company and there are 10. If you achieve copper smelting with half the carbon emissions of all your competitors, and there is a carbon pricing mechanism involved, suddenly you have a 5% or a 3% or any kind of margin advantage over all your competitors. So that will suddenly give you scale, more advantages. I think there's a real opportunity there in what you would call a brown to green investing approach to the largest emitting sectors, because, a small startup carbon sequestration technology company might grow its technology and make 100 million of revenues in the next 10 years. But really, that's quite small scale, whereas these huge industrial companies are emitting hundreds and hundreds of thousands of tons of carbon every single year. And if you can find one that's going to reduce their emissions by 10,000 tons per year over the next decade, that's actually hugely impactful, both from a climate perspective and from a cost and therefore investment perspective. So I think there's a really interesting way to reverse it and actually invest in the worst emitters who are doing the best job at reducing those emissions. And I think that's a strategy that I thought might put a smile on your face, Nick.
Yeah, so it depends on how effective they are at cutting their emissions rather than how much they emit relative to their competitors. So, if you compare two oil companies and one of them's got an effective way of sequestering its carbon because, say, it drills its oil in a particular way that allows it to sequester carbon in a particularly efficient way, that oil company could outperform. It's an interesting idea. It assumes that the government's going to do a decent job of implementing what would amount to a carbon tax, a constraint on the cost. And you know what I think about governments imposing such constraints effectively, especially given what's happened so far. I've got to say, Kit, to me, it's just that classic quote about all causes, start off as a well-meaning endeavor and they end up becoming a racket. It certainly feels like that so far for CCS. But if we stick with this hard constraint of net zero, then we don't have much choice.
Yeah, I mean, you are right that the investment thesis would be interesting and that a carbon price would implement that. But I think you're wrong to realize that it hasn't already happened. I mean, the big story around Tesla 2 years ago was that most of its profits were coming from actually the selling of carbon credits, not of cars, because it was a green company. Fiat Chrysler and GM and Ford and all these companies were buying carbon credits off it. It wasn't making a profit off cars. And the EU ETS, which is the emissions trading scheme in Europe, has actually been a pretty well run, imperfect, but improving system for pricing carbon within the European Union. And companies who are high emitting are starting to struggle under the burden and find ways around it. And it is forcing improvement in those. So emissions pricing is here. It's not yet global and it's not yet perfect, but it's something we're working on. And post-Brexit in the UK, we're building our own scheme as well. So yeah, carbon pricing, if you think it is going to be here to stay, there is a possible advantage if you can revalue every single company in the world and find the ones that are cheaper based on this new carbon price system we're going to operate in. There's definitely an investment opportunity there.
Well, look, on the optimistic side, I'm sure all of this will work out to be much like the diesel scandal, where it turns out everything we were doing actually increased emissions. So it was always a waste of time in the end anyway. But for the moment, I think these technologies that are developing now, the CCS and the companies that are attempting them, should be on investors' radar. Thanks very much for joining us, everyone home. And Kit, thanks for coming on.
Pleasure.